It was a regular morning at Jefferson High School, tucked away in a quiet town where life seemed to move at a slower pace. The students hustled through the hallways, laughter and chatter filling the air as they moved between classes. Teachers stood outside their classrooms, greeting students with smiles or giving last-minute instructions before the next bell rang. In the midst of all the commotion, one person silently worked behind the scenes, making sure everything ran smoothly. Mr. Frank, the school janitor, had been working at Jefferson High for over a decade, maintaining the cleanliness of the school and taking care of any repairs that needed attention. Mr. Frank wasn't a man who liked attention. He preferred to keep to himself, doing his work diligently, without expecting anything in return. The students often passed by him without much thought, unaware of the man who worked tirelessly behind the scenes to keep their school in top shape. He was never in the spotlight, but he was always there, cleaning the hallways, scrubbing the floors, and making sure the bathrooms were spotless. His job wasn't glamorous, but it was essential, and Mr. Frank took pride in it, no matter how mundane it might seem. Despite his humble role at the school, Mr. Frank had a deep sense of pride in his work. He'd been at the school for so long that he had seen generations of students come and go. Over the years, he had become a fixture at the school, one of the quiet constants that the students could rely on, even if they never took the time to acknowledge him. But Mr. Frank didn't mind. He wasn't one for attention or accolades. He was simply happy to do his job and help in any way he could. But there was one thing that weighed heavily on Mr. Frank's heart: his car. The old sedan he drove to work every day had seen better days. The engine sputtered and groaned every time he started it, and the brakes had a way of making strange noises whenever he tried to stop. It was a constant source of stress for him, especially during the winter months when the cold made the car even more unreliable. He had hoped to save up enough money to replace it someday, but the bills always seemed to pile up, and the dream of owning a new car felt out of reach. One afternoon, everything changed for Mr. Frank, and it all started with a phone call. He had just finished sweeping the main hallway when the school principal, Mrs. Carter, came out of her office and waved him over. He set his broom down and walked over, wondering what this was about. Mrs. Carter was a kind woman, but she didn't often call him into her office unless there was an issue to discuss. "Mr. Frank, could you come in for a moment?" she asked with a smile. "Of course, Mrs. Carter," he replied, following her into the office. As he stepped inside, he was surprised to find someone else sitting in the room. It wasn't just Mrs. Carter. There was a young man sitting across from her. He was tall and well-dressed, with short dark hair and a calm demeanor. It took Mr. Frank a moment to recognize him. "Mr. Frank, I'd like you to meet Barron Trump," Mrs. Carter said, gesturing to the young man. "He's here for a charity event in the area, and he wanted to stop by to meet you." Mr. Frank's heart skipped a beat. Barron Trump, the son of former President Donald Trump? He had heard about Barron in the news, but never imagined he would meet him in person, let alone have a conversation with him. Barron stood up, extending his hand with a warm smile. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Frank," he said. Mr. Frank shook his hand, still in shock. I didn't expect this," he stammered, trying to hide his surprise. "What brings you here, Mr. Trump?" Barron smiled again. "Well, I've been hearing a lot about you. The principal and a few of the teachers have told me about the work you do here. They've said you've been with the school for a long time, and you've made a real impact on the students and staff. I wanted to do something nice for you to show my appreciation." Mr. Frank was taken aback. He didn't understand why Barron Trump would want to do something nice for him. After all, he was just a janitor. He never expected anyone, let alone someone as famous as Barron, to recognize him for the work he did. Barron continued, "You've been cleaning and maintaining this school for years, and you never ask for anything in return. That's something that deserves recognition. So, I decided I wanted to surprise you with something." Before Mr. Frank could say anything, Barron stood up and gestured for him to follow. Confused, Mr. Frank followed Barron outside, where they walked through the school's parking lot. Mr. Frank was still trying to process what was happening. What kind of surprise was Barron talking about? As they reached the end of the parking lot, Mr. Frank's eyes widened in disbelief. There, parked right in front of them, was a brand new SUV. The vehicle gleamed under the sunlight, its sleek and shiny exterior practically sparkling. Mr. Frank stopped in his tracks, his mouth hanging open. This was a surprise he never could have imagined. Barron turned to him and handed him a set of keys. "This is for you, Mr. Frank," he said. Mr. Frank stood frozen in place, his heart racing. "A new car?" he whispered, barely able to believe what he was hearing. "Yes, Mr. Frank," Barron said with a smile. "I know how much you've been struggling with your old car. It's been breaking down on you, and I wanted to make sure you didn't have to worry about it anymore. This SUV is yours. It's my gift to you." Tears welled up in Mr. Frank's eyes. He couldn't believe it. This was something he never could have dreamed of. His old car was falling apart, and he had been working hard to save up enough money for a new one, but it always seemed out of reach. And now, here he was, standing in front of a brand new SUV, a car that he never thought he would be able to afford. I don't know what to say," Mr. Frank said, his voice thick with emotion. "This is too much. I never expected anything like this." Barron smiled kindly. "You don't need to thank me, Mr. Frank. You've been doing so much for this school and for the students here. You deserve it. You've made a difference in so many lives, and I wanted to make sure you didn't have to worry about your car anymore. I hope this helps make your life a little easier." Mr. Frank wiped away a tear that had fallen down his cheek. He was overwhelmed by the kindness Barron had shown him. It wasn't just the car that touched him, it was the thought behind it. No one had ever done something like this for him before. He had spent so many years working hard without expecting anything in return, and now, here was someone who saw his effort and wanted to show their appreciation. "Thank you," Mr. Frank said, his voice trembling. "I can't express how much this means to me. You've made me feel like I matter." Barron patted him on the back. "You do matter, Mr. Frank. You've made a real difference in this school, and I just wanted to make sure you knew that." As Mr. Frank sat behind the wheel of the new SUV, he couldn't help but smile. It wasn't just the car that made him feel grateful, it was the recognition, the kindness, and the thoughtfulness that Barron had shown him. In that moment, he realized that sometimes the smallest gestures can have the biggest impact. He had always worked in the shadows, doing his job quietly and without complaint. But today, someone had taken the time to see him, to acknowledge him, and to show him that his efforts had not gone unnoticed. The story of Barron's surprise spread throughout the school, and it quickly became the talk of the town. The students were amazed by the generosity Barron had shown, and many of them began to see Mr. Frank in a new light. They realized that the janitor who had always been there for them, quietly cleaning the halls and making sure everything was in order, was more than just the person who kept the school clean. He was a kind, hard-working man who deserved more than anyone could give him. In the weeks that followed, the students of Jefferson High School began to treat Mr. Frank with even more respect and kindness. They took the time to thank him for his hard work, and some even started helping him with small tasks around the school. They had learned a valuable lesson from Barron Trump's unexpected gesture of generosity, that kindness matters, and sometimes the people who do the most work behind the scenes deserve to be recognized. For Mr. Frank, life was never quite the same after that day. The new car was a reminder of the kindness he had received, and it made his daily commute much easier. But more than that, it was a reminder that, even in a world that can sometimes feel indifferent, there are still people who care, who take the time to notice the quiet heroes, and who make the world a better place with simple acts of kindness. Barron Trump's act of generosity had changed Mr. Frank's life in ways he could never have imagined. It had shown him that even in the smallest corners of the world, there are people willing to make a difference, and that sometimes the most unexpected surprises can bring the greatest joy.